The day Nora Ramsey walked into Caldwell, Kansas, she carried nothing but a worn leather Bible pressed against her chest, and the kind of stillness in her eyes that comes only to people who have survived something they were never supposed to survive. It was the summer of 1878, and the Santa Fe Trail still breathed dust into every corner of that sun-scorched town. Caldwell sat at the edge of civilization like a man balanced on a fence post, one boot in the wild and one boot in the settling world. The cattle drive still rumbled through in great brown rivers of horn and hooves, and the saloons still sang their raucous songs every night from sundown to sunup. It was not a place that welcomed a woman traveling alone, and it said so in the way every pair of eyes on the main street tracked her movement from the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and a traveling dress the color of storm clouds that was coated in 3 days' worth of prairie dust. Her boots were thin-soled and cracked, and the single carpetbag she carried was almost certainly empty from the way she held it, which was too loosely, without the weight of anything meaningful inside. But that Bible she held, that Bible like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid around her. The stagecoach driver, a broad-shouldered man named Pete Holloway who had been running the Caldwell line for 11 years, climbed down from his box and handed her the carpetbag before spitting a long stream of tobacco juice into the street. "End of the line, ma'am," he said, not unkindly but not with any great warmth either. "I know it," Nora said, and her voice was steadier than anything about her appearance suggested it should be. She stood there for a moment, looking at the town as though she were taking a measurement of it, deciding whether it would hold her weight. Then she walked toward the only hotel on the main street, which was called the Frontier House and which charged 50 cents a night, which was 50 cents more than Nora Ramsey had to her name. Inside the Frontier House, behind a desk built from rough pine boards, sat a man named Gerald Potts, who was the owner, the clerk, the cook when the regular cook was drunk, and the primary source of gossip in all of Caldwell. He watched her come through the door with the particular interest of a man who catalogs strangers for entertainment. Looking for a room, he asked, already knowing she was. "I am," Nora said. "I'm also looking for work if there's anyone in this town who might need a capable woman. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep accounts, and I can manage a household." Gerald Potts leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "That's so. You got people here, or you coming from elsewhere?" "I'm coming from Abilene," she said. "I was employed there as a housekeeper for the Bradley family, but they've gone back east." She paused, and something shifted briefly behind her eyes, a shadow of something she wasn't saying. "I need to find a new position." Gerald stroked his chin. "Well now. It just so happens that Charles Winslow over at the Broken Spur Ranch has been looking for a housekeeper going on 2 months. His last one, old Martha Greer, took herself to live with her daughter in Wichita. Ranch house gets dirty on its own, and he's got 3 ranch hands eating there twice a day. You might ride out and ask him. How far is the Broken Spur? About 4 miles northeast. Big spread. You'll see the gate got a painted board over it." He paused. "I'll tell you plain, though. Winslow's not an easy man. He's fair and he's decent, but he's not what you'd call warm company. Keeps to himself mostly." "That suits me fine," Nora said quietly. Gerald Potts gave her a room that night on the basis of her word that she would pay him once she found employment, a gesture of trust that surprised her, and which she filed carefully away in the part of her heart that still believed people could be good to each other. She sat on the narrow bed in her room that night with the Bible open on her knees and did not read it, just looked at the pages the way a person looks at something familiar when they are trying to remember who they are. After a while she closed it, and the name stamped in gold leaf on the first interior page caught the lamplight. Ramsey, William T. Below it in a careful hand was written, "Given to William Tobias Ramsey on the occasion of his 18th birthday, by his loving mother, June Ramsey, 1851. Nora touched the inscription with one finger, then closed the cover and pressed her palm flat against it, and that was all the grieving she did that night. In the morning, she borrowed a horse from the livery stable, a transaction conducted on the same basis of credit as the room, and rode the 4 miles northeast to the Broken Spur ranch beneath a sky that was turning from pink to brass in the early heat. The land out here was flat in the way that makes you feel both free and terrifyingly exposed, with the prairie grass running in silver-green waves in every direction, and the occasional cottonwood marking where water ran underground. She could smell cattle on the air long before she saw them. The gate to the Broken Spur was exactly as Gerald Potts had described, a pair of rough-hewn posts supporting a crossbar from which hung a painted plank reading WINSLOW, Broken Spur Ranch. The letters were well-formed and careful, which told her something. Beyond the gate, a wagon road ran straight toward a cluster of buildings, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a main house that was bigger than she'd expected, but had the look of a building that was not being properly attended to. The yard needed clearing. The porch needed sweeping. The windows were dusty. She rode up to the porch, dismounted, and tied her horse to the rail. Before she could knock, the door opened. Charles Winslow was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the particular way of men who work with their bodies every day, with dark hair that was in need of a cut and eyes the color of weathered denim, a blue gone gray from sun and wind. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and carried a coffee cup in his right hand, and he looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts surprise and wariness. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who does not spend it carelessly. "My name is Nora Ramsey. I'm staying at the Frontier House in town. Gerald Potts told me you might be looking for a housekeeper." Charles Winslow looked at her for a long moment, then looked at her horse, then looked back at her. "You came out here by yourself." "I did. On that horse. It belongs to the livery stable. I borrowed it on credit." Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Gerald Potts told you I was looking for help." "He did." "Gerald Potts," Charles said slowly, "runs the biggest mouth in Sumner County." He paused. "But he's not wrong. Come inside." The house was exactly as its exterior suggested: solid construction, good bones, and badly in need of a woman's attention. The kitchen was functional but cluttered. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a good oak table, and bookshelves along one wall that were filled with actual books, which surprised her. The floors were swept but not scrubbed, and 3 days' worth of dishes sat in the dry sink. "I've got 3 hands: Billy Crane, Tom Adler, and an older man named Rio who does the breaking," Charles said. "They eat breakfast here at 6 and supper at 7. I eat whenever the work allows. The house needs full keeping, cleaning, cooking, washing. Pay is $12 a month in a room." He gestured toward a door on the far side of the kitchen. "It's small, but it's private." "May I see it?" He led her to the room. It was small, with a window that looked east, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. It smelled of cedar and clean emptiness. "I'll take the position," Nora said. Charles gave her a look that suggested he had expected negotiation and was slightly disoriented by the lack of it. "Don't you want to know anything about the terms? About me?" "Gerald Potts told me you were fair and decent," she said. "That's sufficient for now. We can form opinions of each other as we go." He stared at her for another moment, then gave a single nod. "All right, Miss Ramsey. Can you start today?" "I already have," she said, and she set her Bible on the washstand in the small room, removed her bonnet, and walked back to the kitchen to address the dishes. Charles Winslow stood in the doorway of his own kitchen watching this happen with an expression that was, for the first time in a long time, something close to bewilderment. The first week at the Broken Spur established certain things. Nora Ramsey could cook. This was not a small matter in a house feeding 4 working men twice a day, and the 3 ranch hands, Billy, Tom, and Rio, made their appreciation known in the most direct cowboy fashion, which was to eat seconds without being told they could, and thirds without apology. Billy Crane was 22, sandy-haired, and cheerful in a relentless way that would have been irritating in someone less genuinely good-natured. Tom Adler was quiet, mid-30s, and respectful with the formality of a man who had been raised to be careful around women. Rio was somewhere north of 50, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, with a Mexican mother and an Apache grandfather, and a command of horses that bordered on the supernatural. He called Nora Senora from the first day despite her correction, and eventually she stopped correcting him. Charles himself was harder to read. He came in for supper each evening, ate without complaint, and with what she gradually recognized was genuine appreciation, though he rarely said so directly, answered questions when she had them about the running of the household, and was otherwise contained within himself in a way that felt less like coldness and more like habit. She got the impression he had been alone long enough that solitude had become a second skin. She did not ask about his history, and he did not ask about hers, which suited them both. On the 9th day, the arrangement shifted. She had been cleaning the main room and had moved the books from the shelves to dust behind them. She handled them carefully because they were clearly important to him. Dickens, Scott, a well-worn copy of the Federalist Papers, several volumes on cattle ranching and land law. When she lifted the third shelf's contents, a photograph slipped from between two books and fell face-up on the floor. It was a studio portrait of two young men standing with their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the uncalculated joy of people who don't yet know that photographs are sometimes the last record of the living. One of them was clearly a younger Charles Winslow, perhaps 20, with the same denim blue eyes and without the hardness that time and loss tend to deposit around a man's mouth. The other young man she did not know, but there was something about the set of his jaw, the shape of his nose, that tugged at her in a way she couldn't immediately name. She set the photograph on the table intending to ask Charles where he wanted it put back. He came in for supper at 7:30 and stopped dead when he saw the photograph on the table. "I was dusting behind the books," Nora said quickly. "It fell. I didn't mean to disturb anything." "It's all right," Charles said. He crossed to the table and picked up the photograph, and the way he held it told her everything about what it meant to him before he said another word. "That's my brother, Daniel. He died 4 years ago, fever." "I'm sorry," she said. He set the photograph down and looked at her with that measured quality he carried everywhere, as though he were always deciding how much of himself to spend on any given moment. "You got people." "I had a brother," she said. "He died 2 years ago." Something in his face changed, a small adjustment, the kind that happens when two strangers discover they are standing on the same piece of ground. "I'm sorry too," he said. They sat down to supper, and the conversation was different from that night forward. Not effusive or dramatically intimate, but different in the way a door is different when someone has turned the latch. Small things at first. He told her about the ranch, that he had built it himself starting in 1872, that he had bought the first 100 head on borrowed money, that the Broken Spur now ran nearly 800 cattle on 6,000 acres. She told him about Abilene, about the Bradley family she had kept house for, about the way the cattle town had been when it was wild, and how it was taming itself now that the railroad was shifting the trade south. They did not speak of their brothers again for some time, but the fact of having spoken of them once sat between them like a small warm fire. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when the Bible incident happened, and it changed everything. She had left the Bible on the washstand in her room, as she always did, and on this particular evening she had carried it to the main room because the light in her room was poor and she had wanted to read. She left it on the table when she went to the kitchen to prepare the morning biscuits, and Charles came in from a late check of the cattle to find the room empty and the Bible sitting open on the oak table. He would have simply moved it to make room for the lamp, except that the cover was open, and the name stamped in gold leaf was visible in the flickering light. Ramsey, William T., and below it, in June Ramsey's careful hand, 1851. Charles Winslow went pale. He stood very still, staring at the name, and by the time Nora came back from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, he had not moved. His face had gone the color of chalk dust, and his eyes had a quality in them that she did not recognize, something between shock and a grief so old it had gone rigid. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "Charles, are you all right?" He looked up at her slowly, as though surfacing from deep water. "This Bible," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Where did you get it?" "It was my brother's. It was given to him by our mother." "William Ramsey," he said. "Yes, William Tobias Ramsey. He was 4 years older than me." She stopped because something was clearly very wrong. "Did you know him?" Charles set the Bible down on the table with the same care she had always used, and he pulled out a chair and sat down because his legs had decided to do that without his input. He pressed both hands flat on the table's surface and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her. "William Ramsey saved my life," he said, "in the winter of 1874. I was riding a section of the western pasture and my horse went through the ice on a pond I didn't know was frozen thin in the middle. I went in, and the cold hit me so hard I couldn't get purchase on the bank. William was riding through. He was passing through from Dodge City on his way somewhere. I never learned where, and he saw me and he went in after me. He stopped. He pulled me out. It took him 2 attempts. He nearly went under himself." He looked at Nora and his eyes were carrying something immense. "I have thought about that man every winter since. I tried to find him, to thank him properly, to repay him somehow, and I never could locate him." Nora sat down across from him. Her hands were clasped on the table in front of her, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something that was both sorrow and a kind of profound recognition. "He was ill for the last 2 years of his life," she said. "The same winter, 1874, he was here in Kansas. He went to California afterward looking for work. He contracted something in San Francisco. He came back to me in Abilene in 1875, and he died in the spring of 1876. She paused. "He was 27. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them they were steady, but only barely. "I am sorry, Miss Ramsey. I am genuinely, deeply sorry." "He never told me about you," she said, and her voice was soft. "But that sounds exactly like something he would have done. He would have gone in after you and never thought it worth mentioning." They sat across from each other in the lamplight for a long time after that, the Bible between them on the oak table, the gold leaf name catching the light between them, and neither of them spoke because sometimes a silence is the only container large enough for what needs to be held. After a while Nora reached out and closed the Bible. "He was a good man," she said. "Yes," Charles said. "I know that for certain." From that night forward, something was different at the Broken Spur, though it would have been difficult to identify exactly what had changed if you were looking from outside. Charles began staying up a little later after supper. Nora began making coffee before she went to bed rather than leaving him to make it himself. They talked about books first, since the shelf provided obvious material, and then about ideas, and then about their lives in the expanding, tentative way of 2 people who have decided that the other one is worth the risk of being known. He told her he had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1870, at the age of 23. With his brother Daniel and $300 they had saved between them from 2 years of farm labor. He told her about the first winter on the open range when they had lived in a dugout and eaten mostly jackrabbit and dried beans. He told her about Daniel, who had been bright and funny, and who had died so fast from the fever that there had been no time to prepare for it, and about the particular quality of grief that comes from losing the last person who knew you before you became who you are now. Nora told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother's death when Nora was 12 and William was 16, about the way William had taken that event and turned himself from a boy into something more careful and responsible almost overnight. She told him about the years of moving, Missouri to Illinois to Iowa to Kansas, following work, following the idea that the next place would be steadier than the last. She told him what she had not told anyone in Caldwell, that she had been engaged once to a man in Abilene named Carter Duncan, who had turned out to have a wife already enceinte. Louis, a fact she had not discovered until she was 3 weeks from what she had believed would be her wedding day. Charles listened to this last part with a stillness that was not indifference but was its opposite, the kind of attention that does not interrupt because it is too busy taking everything in. "He was a coward," Charles said when she finished. "Yes," Nora said. "I know that now. At the time I thought the problem was me." "The problem was not you," Charles said, with a directness and certainty that caught her off guard, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there for 2 years. July settled over the ranch with its full summer weight, and the work intensified. The cattle needed moving to the upper pasture. There was a section of fence down along the northern border, and a buyer from Wichita was due to come look at 100 head that Charles had ready to sell. He was gone from before sunup until after dark most days, and Nora managed the house and the cooking, and found herself on the quieter afternoons sitting on the porch with a book from his shelf, looking out over the wide Kansas land, and feeling something she had not felt in a long time, which was a sense that she might be in the right place. Billy Crane noticed this before anyone else did, because Billy Crane, despite his youth and his cheerful recklessness, had the observational powers of someone who has spent his life reading the signs the land gives about the weather. He mentioned it to Tom Adler one evening in the barn. "You see how the boss looks at her when she's not looking," Billy said. "Keep your nose out of it," Tom said, which was Tom's preferred response to anything he agreed with but didn't want to encourage. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Stop saying it." Rio, who was checking the hoof of a sorrel mare in the next stall and who missed nothing, said without looking up, "Things find their own time." Billy and Tom both looked at him. He offered nothing further and returned his attention to the hoof, and they left it there. The buyer from Wichita came on a Thursday in the second week of July, a heavy man named Aldous Marsh, who arrived in a buggy that was too fine for the roads he'd taken to get here, and who clearly thought of himself as more sophisticated than the people he was dealing with, which was an error that Charles absorbed without comment and used strategically in the negotiation that followed. They talked cattle prices for 2 hours on the porch, and Nora brought out coffee and then cold water and then coffee again, moving efficiently and invisibly in the background. When Marsh made his final offer, which was $2 below what Charles wanted per head, Charles said nothing for a long moment, and Marsh began to feel the discomfort of that silence and revised upward by $1.50, and Charles accepted. After Marsh drove away in his too fine buggy, Charles came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe with his hat in his hands and a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "You got your price," Nora said. "Near enough." He paused. "You noticed that, did you? I was pouring coffee, not sleeping," he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully without reservation, and it transformed his face in a way that left her momentarily unsteady. It was a good laugh, warm and genuine, the kind that lives in a man's chest and comes out when he forgets to be careful. "You're an observant woman, Miss Ramsey," he said. "Nora," she said. "We've been living under the same roof for a month. You can call me Nora." He looked at her for a moment with those weathered blue eyes. "Nora," he said. Just the name by itself, but the way he said it did something to the air between them. "Charles," she returned, and there was a beat of silence that was different from all the comfortable silences they had built together. This one had an edge on it, a kind of electricity. And then Billy Crane came banging through the back door asking about supper, and the moment dispersed and they both looked elsewhere. That night, after supper was done and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean, Nora sat at the table with her Bible and Charles sat across from her with a volume of Dickens, and they read in companionable silence for nearly an hour. The lamp burned between them, and the night sounds of the prairie came through the open window: insects, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional call of a nighthawk. "Can I ask you something?" Charles said without looking up from his book. "Yes." What are you looking for here, I mean, in Kansas, in general? He looked up then, and the lamplight made the lines of his face look carved. You said you move around. Missouri to Illinois to Iowa to Kansas. What would make you stop? Nora set her Bible down and considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Something that felt permanent, she said finally. Something worth staying for. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at his book. But she noticed that he didn't turn the page for quite a long while after that. August arrived hot and gusty, and with it came a complication named Frank Dooley. Frank Dooley was a man who had worked at the Broken Spur 2 years back, before Charles had let him go for reasons that involved the unauthorized consumption of a considerable quantity of the ranch's winter whiskey stores, and an altercation with Rio that had ended poorly for Dooley and his dignity. He showed up one afternoon when Charles was out on the range and knocked on the kitchen door with the particular confidence of a man who has decided to revise history in his own favor. Nora opened the door. Dooley was in his mid-40s, raw-boned and weathered, with the kind of eyes that stay flat when the face around them is smiling. He asked to see Charles, and Nora told him Charles was out on the range and she didn't know when he'd be back. You the new housekeeper? Dooley said, leaning against the doorframe in a way that was designed to take up more space than was his to take. Winslow's always had good luck with his housekeepers. I'll tell him you called, Nora said, and began to close the door. Dooley put his hand against it. Now hold on, I was just being friendly. You can be friendly from the porch, Nora said, and the steadiness in her voice surprised him enough that he actually took a step back. She closed the door and latched it. When Charles came in that evening and she told him, he went to the window and stood looking out toward the gate for a moment. Then he turned around. Dooley's been drifting around this part of the county for a month. He's looking for work and he won't find it here. He looked at her directly. Did he frighten you? No, she said. And then, honestly, a little, not much. I'll speak to him if he comes back. And Nora, he paused, choosing words with the same care he brought to everything. I want you to know that this is a safe place. I take that seriously. She looked at him and believed it absolutely. I know, she said. Dooley came back once more 3 days later when Charles was in the yard. The conversation between the two men was brief and conducted at a low register that Nora couldn't hear from the kitchen, but its content was clear from Dooley's posture, which went from aggressive to uncomfortable to resigned over the course of about 4 minutes. He mounted his horse and rode out the gate and did not come back. What did you say to him? Nora asked that evening. I reminded him of some things about the law and some things about me, Charles said, both of which are better incentives than threats. She nodded. He's gone for good. He's gone for good. There was something in that certainty, in the uncomplicated way he had handled it, and then reported it to her as a matter she had a right to know the outcome of, that moved her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Carter Duncan, in his time, had never once made her feel like her safety was something he thought about. The contrast was not dramatic or sudden, but it settled into her understanding quietly and stayed there. September brought a cooling and a slowing, the frantic pace of summer easing into the measured rhythm of fall. The cattle had been sorted and the 100 head sold to Marsh were gone to Wichita. The winter preparations needed to begin, supplies brought in, the barn winterized, the house inspected for drafts. Nora found herself at home in these tasks with an ease that had been growing all summer. She knew where everything was. She knew the rhythm of the place. She knew that Rio preferred his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and that Billy took his with so much sugar it was nearly syrup, and that Tom Adler didn't want his eggs touching his biscuits on the plate, and that Charles took everything plain and without complaint. But he had a particular pleasure in her cornbread that he expressed only by eating 3 pieces without looking up, which she had learned to read as the equivalent of a formal declaration. On a Saturday evening in mid-September, Charles asked her if she would like to ride with him the next morning to see the upper pasture before the fall roundup. She said yes with perhaps slightly more speed than was strictly necessary, and she saw him notice it, and she decided to let that stand without correction. They rode out at dawn, when the Kansas sky was doing its extravagant best, laying pink and orange in long bands from one horizon to the other, and the grass was silver with dew. Charles rode a big gray gelding, and she rode the same livery horse she had borrowed her first day and never quite gotten around to returning, which had become a small unofficial adoption that everyone pretended not to notice. They didn't talk much on the ride out, which was comfortable in the way that only happens between people who have gotten past the stage where silence needs to be filled. The land opened up as they climbed gradually toward the upper pasture, 600 acres of rich bluestem grass that had gone amber and gold in the fall. The cattle moved like slow ships through it. In the early light, with the sky vast and the land rolling and the smell of cattle and autumn grass in the air, it was as beautiful as anything Nora had ever seen. They stopped at the high point of the pasture and looked out over the broken spur in its full extent, and Charles said, "I built it from nothing, not with boastfulness but with the quiet wonder of a man who still can't quite believe what his hands have made." "I know," Nora said. "Daniel should be here to see it," Charles said after a moment. "I know that too," she said softly. He looked at her sideways, and the morning light was in his eyes, and something in his expression had dropped its customary reserve in the way that can happen outdoors, away from walls and roofs and the habitual furniture of caution. "Nora," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I'm going to ask it plain because I don't know how to be otherwise." "Ask it," she said. "Is there any part of you that could see a future here, not just as a housekeeper?" As he stopped, and she was struck by the fact that this self-contained, deliberate man was, for the first time she'd seen, struggling for words. He looked out over the pasture rather than at her. "I know it's not much to offer. Hard winters and hard work and a lot of empty country." "You're not asking me to be a housekeeper," she said. He looked back at her. "No, I'm not." Nora held his gaze across the small space between their horses, and what she felt in that moment was not the dramatic upwelling of something sudden, but rather the recognition of something that had been there for a while, steady and real and patient in the way that the best things tend to be. "I came here with nothing," she said. "I had a Bible and an empty carpetbag and a borrowed horse, and I've been here 3 months and I don't feel like nothing anymore." She paused. "That's because of this place." "Because of you," she looked at him steadily. "Yes, Charles, there is a part of me that could see a future here." He was quiet for a long moment, and the horses moved together without being directed, closing the space between them until his boot was almost touching hers. "Then I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. And she smiled at him, and he smiled back. And it was the kind of smile that people who work hard and live in the weather rarely let loose because they've learned to be economical with the things that matter most, which means when it finally comes it is absolutely genuine. The courtship was quiet by some standards but rich by others. There were Sunday afternoon rides across the ranch, ranging farther each week as the weather held. There were evenings in the main room with their respective books that gradually gave way to more conversation and less reading. There were moments of small, deliberate tenderness, Charles insisting she take the heavy cast iron pot from the hook herself so she wouldn't strain her shoulder, which was his way of caring without making her feel tended to. Nora mending a tear in his good shirt without mentioning it, which was hers. Billy Crane was transparently delighted by these developments and made his feelings known in the form of extremely subtle remarks that were about as subtle as a cattle stampede. Tom Adler told him to mind his business, so often it became a kind of chorus. Rio watched everything with the ancient calm of a man who has seen seasons and not just days, and one evening, when Charles was returning from a late ride with color in his face that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the hour he had just spent talking with Nora on the porch, Rio simply said, "Bueno," and went back to cleaning his saddle. Charles told her in October about the land around the broken spur, how it had been before the ranchers and before the cattle drives, whose land it had been, and what had happened to the people who had lived on it. He talked about it with a complexity that surprised her. He had seen what had been done to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the Kiowa in this part of Kansas, the displacement and the broken agreements and the particular cruelty of a government that signed treaties with one hand and broke them with the other. And he did not pretend this history didn't exist, or that his own presence on this land was untangled from it. It was one of the things about him that she filed away carefully in the part of herself where she kept the truest things about him. "It's not something most men out here talk about," she said. "Most men don't think it applies to them," he said. "I'm not sure it doesn't apply to all of us." In November, on a Sunday when the first real cold had come and the sky was the pale gray of old pewter, Charles drove her into Caldwell in the wagon, which was unusual. Sunday trips to town were generally a solo affair. He stopped at the general store, and while Nora was looking at a bolt of dark blue wool flannel, he had a conversation with the man at the counter that she couldn't quite hear. When they came back out, he handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" she said. "Open it." It was a pair of leather gloves, the quality of a woman's riding gloves, lined with fleece. Her old ones had been worn through at the fingertips for weeks. She had not mentioned this to him. She looked at the gloves for a moment and then looked at him, and the expression on his face was the studied neutrality of a man hoping very hard that he has not overstepped. "Charles," she said, "you were losing feeling in your fingers on the Sunday rides," he said. "I noticed." She looked down at the gloves again. When she looked back up, she was not entirely composed, and she could see him register this and worry about it. "They're the nicest thing anyone has bought for me in a very long time," she said. He exhaled. "All right, good." She put them on right there in the street, and he stood watching with his hands in his coat pockets, and that quality on his face that she was learning to recognize as his version of happiness, understated but absolute, like a lamp behind frosted glass. December arrived with serious cold and a winter routine that settled over the ranch with its own particular intimacy. The days were shorter and the evenings were longer, and the time spent in the warm kitchen and the fire-lit main room felt different from the summer evenings in the way that winter light feels different from summer light, more concentrated, more necessary, more noticed. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of December, they were sitting by the fire, she mending, he reading, and he looked up from his book without particular preamble and said, "I would like to ask you to marry me, but I want to do it correctly." "May I?" She set down her mending. "That is asking me," she said. He looked briefly frustrated. "I meant formally, on a knee and so on." She studied him, this serious, decent, complicated man who had been alone for too long and who had built something remarkable from nothing, and who had kept faith with her brother's memory without even knowing he had. "Get up then," she said. He put down his book and came over to where she sat and lowered himself to one knee on the braided rug in front of the fire, and he looked up at her with those weathered blue eyes that were, at this particular moment, entirely unguarded. "Nora Ramsey," he said, "I know I am not an easy man. I know this is hard country, but I am certain of very few things in my life, and I am certain of this. I want you here, not as a housekeeper, as my wife, as my partner in this place. I love you, and I would be honored if you would marry me." She looked at him for a moment, and the fire crackled between them and the wind pushed at the windows and the whole vast cold prairie pressed against the walls of the house, and inside it was warm and lit and real. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He took her hands in both of his, and his hands were large and work-rough and warm, and he held hers with a care that was exactly right, firm enough to be real and gentle enough to be true. He rose from his knee and stood before her, and she rose with him, and he kissed her for the first time, carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything. And it was the right kind of first kiss, the kind that feels less like a beginning than a recognition. They told Billy, Tom, and Rio at breakfast the next morning. Billy Crane reacted with the uncontained enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for exactly this announcement for approximately 5 months. leaping from his chair and knocking over his coffee cup, and apologizing for the coffee while simultaneously congratulating them and making an absolute spectacle of himself. Tom Adler shook Charles's hand with great formality and then turned to Nora and said, simply, "You're good for him," which was the highest compliment Tom Adler had it in him to give. Rio looked at them both for a moment with those ancient sharp eyes, and then he said, "This is good," in a tone of such complete certainty that it settled the matter entirely. They were married in January of 1879, in the small church that Caldwell had built the year before, with the Reverend Miles Holloway, who had no relation to Pete the stagecoach driver despite the shared name, officiating. The church held maybe 60 people comfortably, and it held 75 that day because Caldwell was a town where an event was an event, and people came out for it with enthusiasm. Gerald Potts from the Frontier House sat in the front row looking personally satisfied in the way of a man who feels he has had a hand in bringing something good about, which, in a minor way, he had. Rio, Billy, and Tom sat together in the second pew, Billy in a clean shirt that was clearly new and still showed the fold marks from the shop. Nora wore a dress she had made from the dark blue wool flannel Charles had purchased for her in November, and she wore the gloves he had given her against the cold outside. Her hair was pinned with care and a small spray of dried wildflowers that she had saved from the summer. She carried the Bible, her brother's Bible, held against her side as she walked up the aisle, not as a prop, but as what it was, a connection between this moment and the man who had made it possible without knowing he was doing so. When the Reverend asked for the vows and Charles turned to her and took both her hands and spoke those words clearly, without hesitation, in his low, measured voice that she had learned by now was the voice of his truest self, she understood that all the moving and the losing and the hard years of not quite belonging anywhere had been the territory you have to cross to find the right place. They had both crossed it. They had arrived. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the church hall, organized mainly by the women of the town, with the same cooperative efficiency that the frontier required of everything. And there was fiddle music. And Charles Winslow danced with his wife for the first time, and managed it with the earnest determination of a man who has not danced recently but intends to do it right. And Nora laughed at his expression of concentration, and he laughed at himself for it. And they danced badly and happily for the better part of an hour. Winter at the Broken Spur after the wedding had a different quality from the winters before it, at least for Charles, who had spent many of them alone in a house that was large enough to echo. The evenings now were shared. The mornings were shared. The small domestic geography of two people living together, who gets up first, who keeps the fire going through the night, whose boots end up by the wrong door, had to be worked out with the occasional friction that such negotiations require, and they worked it out with the honesty that was characteristic of them both, which meant directly and without letting grievances calcify. They disagreed sometimes. Charles had a tendency towards silence when he was troubled that Nora found frustrating, and she had a tendency to keep her worries close until they were past the point of easy resolution, which frustrated him equally. These are not large incompatibilities in a marriage, but they are real ones, and they dealt with them the same way they dealt with most things, by being straight with each other eventually, and by having the patience to wait for eventually. In March, Nora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, while she was making the breakfast biscuits, because she had thought about how to say it and had decided that with Charles, plain was best. He went very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, very carefully, as though she had become suddenly precious in a new way that the old way of holding her wasn't quite adequate to express. He pressed his face against her hair and didn't say anything at all for a long moment. "A child," he said finally. "In September, I think." He turned her gently around and looked at her face with an expression that she had no previous reference for on him. It was joy of a quality so undefended that she felt her throat close. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel perfectly fine," she said. "The biscuits are going to burn." He laughed, still holding her. "Let them burn, Charles." "Let them burn," he said again. And there was something in his voice that she decided to agree with, and the biscuits burned, and breakfast was late, and the three ranch hands exchanged looks over the burned biscuits and said nothing whatsoever. The spring and summer of 1879 passed with the double rhythm of ranch work and a growing life, and Nora moved through it with the pragmatic grace of a woman who has never had the luxury of fragility, but who accepts care when it is offered without the defenses she used to carry against it. Charles was attentive in his practical way, making sure she didn't lift what she shouldn't lift, appearing at the kitchen door regularly on the grounds of needing water or some other pretext so transparent that she called him on it twice, and he looked unrepentant both times. He built a crib in the evenings, working in the barn with focused care, measuring twice and cutting once in the manner of everything he did. She would come out sometimes and sit on a hay bale and watch him work, and he would talk while his hands were busy, about the ranch, about plans for expanding the north pasture, about a new bull he was considering purchasing, and gradually, tentatively, about Daniel, about what Daniel would have made of all this, which led to conversations about William, about what William Ramsey had been, and what he had meant to each of them in ways they were still discovering. "He brought you here," Charles said one evening, setting down his plane to look at her. "In a way," she agreed. "In every way," he said. "He saved my life, and then his Bible carried his name all the way to my table. If I hadn't seen that name," he stopped. "We would have figured it out another way," Nora said. "I believe that we would have found our way to each other." Charles considered this with his characteristic deliberateness. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't want to need the other way. I'm grateful for the way it happened." She smiled at him. "So am I." Their son was born in the first week of September, 1879, with the help of the doctor who came out from Caldwell, and a capable woman named Ada Reeves who had served as midwife at more broken spur area births than anyone could count. The labor was long, and Nora endured it with a determination that impressed even Ada Reeves, who was not easily impressed. Charles spent most of the labor on the porch and part of it in the barn, on the grounds that he was not useful inside, and that his inability to do anything about what was happening to Nora was a suffering he felt more acutely than he had expected. When Ada came to the barn door and said, "Healthy boy, Mr. Winslow," he was inside the house before she finished the sentence. The boy was red and indignant and undeniably present, and Nora held him with an expression of such exhausted radiance that Charles sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at the two of them with no capacity whatsoever for speech. His throat was too full for it. He reached out and put his hand over Nora's where she cradled their son, and she looked at him, and he looked back at her, and everything that needed to be said was in that exchange. They named him Daniel William Winslow, for both brothers. It was Nora's suggestion and Charles's immediately, absolutely, without a moment's hesitation. Billy Crane, upon being informed of the birth and the name, was once again overcome in his characteristic way and knocked over a fence rail in his enthusiasm, which he then repaired with great efficiency, proving that his energy, while spectacular, was at least constructive. Tom Adler said, "Good name," which from Tom was a speech. Rio brought a small carved wooden figure of a horse, smooth and perfectly made, and set it on the kitchen table without explanation, and it remained there for years as a kind of talisman. Life expanded at the broken spur in the way that life at its best tends to, not easily but richly. Daniel William proved to be a solid, good-humored baby who developed into a solid, good-humored small boy who, at 18 months, showed a fascination with horses that Rio observed with the kind of pleasure that a person shows when they see a gift being put to its proper use. In the spring of 1881, Nora told Charles she was expecting again, and he received this news with less controlled emotion than the first time, which she took as a mark in his favor. This time the child, born in November, was a girl, whom they named June for Charles's mother and for Nora's mother both, the name being the kind of coincidence that feels like more than coincidence when you are inclined to believe that things can mean something. June Winslow was, from the beginning, nothing like her brother in personality. Where Daniel was placid, June was electric where he was steady. She was all sparks and motion, and she had her father's blue denim eyes and her mother's auburn coloring, and the combined stubbornness of two people who had each survived considerable amounts of difficulty, which in a small child expressed itself as a spectacular refusal to be told what to do with any efficiency whatsoever. Charles loved her so thoroughly and so obviously that Nora found it funny and told him so, and he was unashamed about it, which was one of the ongoing revelations of their marriage. The places where this careful, contained man was simply and completely without defenses. The broken spur grew. By 1882, Charles had expanded to 8,000 acres and 1,200 head, had taken on 2 more ranch hands, and had built a new bunkhouse and a larger barn. The house itself was expanded, a proper parlor added, another bedroom upstairs for when the children were old enough to need their own space, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. The books moved with the expansion. The shelves moved to the new parlor and populated more thickly now because Nora contributed her own reading, and the household was one in which the evenings often found 2 adults reading on opposite ends of a settee, while 2 small children engaged in whatever small children activities were currently required. Gerald Potts, in town, told anyone who would listen that he had had a hand in the whole thing. Nobody disputed this with any great energy because it was partly true, and because Gerald was basically harmless, and because the story gave him such evident pleasure. Rio stayed at the Broken Spur until the fall of 1882, when his bones informed him that he had earned a different kind of life, and he went south to family in New Mexico, but not before spending an entire Saturday morning teaching 5-year-old Daniel William the correct way to approach a horse, standing 3 feet away and letting it come to you, which was the first lesson and the most important one. Daniel listened with the profound seriousness of a child receiving sacred knowledge and performed it correctly on the first try, and Rio said, "Buono," with the same finality he had brought to all his pronouncements, and it was settled. Billy Crane stayed on and in the fullness of time married a woman named Cecilia Marsh from town, no relation to the cattle buyer, who had come to Caldwell as a school teacher, and who was the best possible thing that could have happened to Billy, providing him with a focus for his enormous energy that kept it aimed in productive directions. They had the Winslow family to Sunday dinner once a month, and it became a fixture, those Sunday dinners, something that the children came to expect and remember. Tom Adler remained at the Broken Spur until 1884, when he inherited a small property from a cousin and went to develop it, and Charles gave him a good horse and 3 months' wages extra and shook his hand and told him he was as solid a man as he had ever known, which was true. Tom received this in the manner he received everything, with quiet, dignified acknowledgement. The new hands who came after a young man from Tennessee named James Polk, who was not related to the president but had heard every joke about it, and an older man named Garrett who had spent 20 years driving cattle up from Texas and wanted to stop moving, were good people who fit themselves into the established character of the Broken Spur in the way that the right people fit into the right places. The years turned. Charles's hair acquired gray at the temples. Nora's laugh lines deepened into something permanent and becoming. Daniel William, at 7, was already following his father around the ranch with the purposefulness of someone conducting an apprenticeship, asking questions in the direct, unrelenting way of children who have decided that understanding things is the primary project of their existence. June, at 5, had already convinced her father to let her ride the most gentle of the ranch horses while held in front of his saddle, and was lobbying with considerable skill for her own pony. Charles, who was theoretically the person in authority on this matter, was clearly going to capitulate long before she turned 6. Nora watched her family, this thing she had built from nothing alongside this man who had built everything from nothing, and felt the full weight of a life that had turned out to be real in all the ways she had stopped expecting it could be. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she and Charles still sat together in the parlor with the fire going and the books on the shelves and the wide Kansas dark outside the windows. The conversation between them had the depth and ease of a channel cut over many years, varied and comfortable and with room for everything. They still surprised each other. That was the thing she had not expected, that after 7 years of marriage they still surprised each other, still found new ground in each other's thinking, still encountered moments where the other person said something that made them look at them and think, "There it is, that's who you are," and it was always both familiar and new. One evening in 1885, she took the Bible from the parlor shelf where it now lived between a volume of Tennyson and a Kansas land records book, and she sat with it open on her lap. The gold leaf inscription caught the firelight the way it always had. "He'd have liked you," she said. Charles looked up from his reading. He didn't need to ask who. "You think?" He said, "I know. He had a very particular radar for good men. He could tell in about 5 minutes." She ran her finger along the inscription. "He would have liked this, all of it." Charles set his book aside. In the firelight, with his gray-touched hair and the decade of lines that the Kansas sun and wind had put on his face, he looked like what he was, a man well used by time and glad of it. "He'd have been a good uncle," Charles said. "He would have absolutely spoiled Daniel and June rotten and handed them back," Nora agreed. "And we'd have been furious about it." "Completely furious," she said, smiling. He smiled back at her, and it was still that smile, the one he rarely gave freely but never withheld from her, warm and unguarded and wholly real. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm glad you rode out that morning." "I'm glad Gerald Potts has a large mouth," she said. "We should probably tell him that." "God, no," Nora said. "He would be insufferable." Charles laughed, and she laughed with him, and the fire burned and the prairie dark settled over the broken spur, and inside the house it was warm and lit, and full of all the particular texture of a life genuinely shared. Spring came to the ranch in 1886 with the kind of particular beauty that only Kansas manages in April, the land going from brown to green so rapidly that you could almost watch it happen hour by hour, the sky enormous and blue and clean after the winter's gray. Daniel William was 7 and June was 5, and they had, between them, turned the broken spur into something livelier than it had been in its bachelor years, with the accumulating evidence of childhood scattered in every direction. A small wooden horse on the porch rail, a half-finished drawing on the kitchen table, a pair of tiny boots by the back door. Nora had taken on a garden in the 2nd year of their marriage, claiming a patch of south-facing ground beside the house that got the full sun, and each spring she expanded it slightly, so that it now produced tomatoes, beans, squash, cucumbers, onions, and a row of flowers along the far edge that had no practical purpose whatsoever, and which she maintained with the conviction that impractical beauty is one of the necessities. Charles built her a better fence around it in the spring of 1886, a project that Daniel William assisted with at great length, and with the comprehensive involvement of someone who feels strongly that all family projects benefit from his presence. Charles gave him a small hammer and genuine nails and let him work on the lower boards, and Daniel William drove nails with a concentration that was his father precisely, brow furrowed, taking the work seriously, and Nora watched them from the kitchen window and filed the image away in the part of her that kept the things she would want to remember when she was old. In June of that year, the month, not the daughter, though June the daughter was very much also present, Charles received a letter from an attorney in Wichita regarding a land parcel adjacent to the Broken Spur's northeast border, some 400 acres that had been held by a man who had died without heirs, and which the bank was now willing to sell. He brought the letter to Nora that evening and put it on the table, and they talked through it the way they always talked through the ranch decisions, as partners, which they were. She asked the right questions. He had the answers to most of them. The ones he didn't, they worked through together. They decided to purchase the land, and the transaction was completed in August, and the Broken Spur became a place of 1,200 acres of deeded land, and the kind of solidity that takes the better part of a decade to build. It was September of 1886, exactly 7 years after Daniel William had been born, when Nora told Charles she believed she was expecting again. She was 32 and he was 39, and they were both aware that this was a gift that might not have been offered if it had been asked for, and they received it with that awareness and with the corresponding gratitude. This child, born in April of 1887, was a boy whom they named James for no particular family reason, but simply because they both liked the name. And the Bible sat on the nightstand during the birth as it always did, its gold leaf inscription, a presence that was by now a comfort and a continuity. James Winslow arrived in the world with a set of opinions about it that he made immediately clear at high volume, and which did not subside significantly as the weeks progressed. He was, from the beginning, the loudest person in any room he occupied, a quality that baffled his even-tempered father and delighted his mother, who found in it an echo of something bright and irrepressible. "He gets it from your side," Charles said on a particularly vocal morning. "My side," Nora said. "My side was quiet. William was quiet. My mother was quiet. I am very nearly silent." "You argue your positions with considerable volume," Charles observed. "That's different," she said. "That's being right." He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was amused and admiring and helpless to be otherwise. "Yes," he agreed. "I suppose it is." 3 children in the house, 7 ranch hands at various points, 1,000+ cattle on 8,000 acres, a garden in full summer abundance, a parlor full of books, an oak table that had been the site of more meals and conversations, and one deeply significant encounter with a gold-lettered name than any table deserved. And on the wall of the parlor, in a frame that Nora had ordered from the catalog in Wichita, a photograph of William Tobias Ramsey that she had found in a small case she'd kept in the carpetbag all those years, the carpetbag that had not in fact been empty that day she arrived. It had contained the photograph, and a change of clothes and a hairbrush and the Bible, which was all that was required. Charles had put the photograph on the wall himself, carefully, making sure it was level, which was the kind of care he brought to everything. He had stood back and looked at it for a moment and then looked at Nora and said, "He should be here," meaning in the house, in the life, in all of it. "He is," she said, and she meant it. The years continued to pass with the indifferent and generous abundance of time in a place where you are rooted. Daniel William, at 9, was riding on his own and was serious about the work of the ranch in a way that made Charles believe, with a quiet and wondering certainty, that the Broken Spur would continue after him. June, at 7, had her pony, a sturdy dun mare she had named Liberty without any prompting, and she rode it with a fearlessness that required a certain amount of parental management, but was never fully curtailed because there are things in a child's nature that you would be wrong to curtail. James, at 2, was everywhere at once and needed watching at all times and was constitutionally unable to comprehend the concept of a restriction, and Charles dealt with this with a patience that Nora found both admirable and faintly miraculous. They had built between them something that had not existed before. Not just the ranch, though the ranch was real and good and solid, but the specific life within it, the texture and the warmth and the accumulated history of days and seasons and choices made together. The table and the fire and the books and the children and the wide prairie outside the windows, and the man and the woman who had arrived at each other from opposite directions and found that where they met was exactly the right place. On a Sunday evening in October of 1889, When the autumn had gone full gold and the air had that particular quality it gets in Kansas in October, sharp and sweet, and carrying the smell of harvest and wood smoke, they sat on the porch together after the children were in bed. The stars were extravagant overhead and the cattle were quiet in the far pastures and the broken spur sat solid and lit around them. Nora had the Bible in her lap. She did that sometimes still, carried it to the porch on evenings when she wanted to feel her brother close. She wasn't reading it. She was just holding it. "Tell me what you see when you look out there," Charles said. He asked her this occasionally, because her way of seeing things was different from his, and he had learned years ago that different was the word for valuable. She looked out over the ranch, the dark shapes of the barn and the bunkhouse, the fence lines catching what moonlight there was, the immensity of the open land beyond. "I see everything we've built," she said. "I see 3 children sleeping in a house they've never known a night without. I see the garden that'll go to seed until spring and come back again. I see the north pasture where the fence you built is still standing." She paused. "I see the place William's Bible led me to." She looked at him. "What do you see?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at his land, his ranch, the life he had made from the raw materials of stubbornness and hard work and considerable amounts of good fortune, the final and greatest piece of which had arrived on a dusty stagecoach with a worn Bible and an empty carpetbag, and a steadiness in her eyes that had told him from the very first morning that here was a person who had survived things and remained, and who was worth remaining for. "I see you," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the stars were doing their business above them, and the prairie was doing its ancient, indifferent, magnificent thing in every direction. And she felt, as she had felt for 11 years now but never with any diminishment, the solid, uncomplicated reality of being loved by this man and loving him back. She reached across and took his hand, and he folded his fingers around hers, and they sat on the porch of the Broken Spur ranch in the autumn dark under the Kansas stars, holding on to each other the way you hold on to things you know are real, with the ease of habit and the care of people who have learned not to take the good things for granted. Inside the house, Daniel Williams slept with the solid gravity of a boy who has tired himself out doing real work. June slept with Liberty's grooming brush still on the floor beside her bed, where she had dropped it after one last brushing before supper. James slept loudly, with the lack of self-consciousness that would mark him all his life. The Bible sat in Nora's lap with its gold-leaf name, and its inscription, and its long journey from a birthday table in Missouri to a dugout in the hard years to Abilene to a stagecoach to a small room in a ranch house in Caldwell, Kansas, and it had done what it was always perhaps intended to do. It had kept William Tobias Ramsey alive in the world long enough to be of use. The rancher had gone pale when he read the name. The housekeeper had seen it. And in that moment of mutual recognition, of grief acknowledged and gratitude finally paid, and 2 lives intersected at the point that mattered most, everything that followed had found its proper beginning. The Broken Spur ranch sat on the Kansas plain as it would sit for decades more. Long after Charles Winslow's gray hair had gone fully white, and long after Nora's laugh lines had deepened into the beautiful wrinkles of a woman who has laughed a great deal. Long after Daniel William had taken the ranch, and added his own character to it, and June had ridden Liberty, until the mare was old and gone, and been given a new horse by her father without commentary, because that was the language he spoke. And long after James had grown into a man who could fill any room with his voice and his conviction, and who was, in the end, recognizably himself and recognizably his mother's son. All of it rooted here. All of it grown from a Bible on a table in the lamplight, and a rancher who went pale, and a woman who was steady, and the long true line that runs between one life and another when the circumstances are exactly right and the people are willing. That was the Broken Spur. That was Charles Winslow and Nora Ramsey, who became Nora Winslow, who arrived with nothing and built, alongside a good man, everything. Everything.